right. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for coming again. I didn't run off everybody from Sunday from this Bible class, but Daniel and Beth are traveling back tonight, and so you'll be back to your regularly scheduled preacher shortly here. We are going to pick up in Judges chapter 16 tonight. We're going to wrap up the story of Samson. But before we do that, we'll get through some of our work. You'll remember the goals of the class: to learn the cycles of sin and how to avoid them, maybe generationally, personally, within the church, things of that nature. Cultivate trust, and I think we keep coming back to Hebrews for some reason in this book, right? Because of Hebrews chapter 11, and cultivate trust, cultivate that faith in our children and the people that we get to be exposed to throughout our lives. And then the overall concept of Judges is what? What's the memory verse? 21:25. There was no king, and everyone did right in their own eyes. And really, we see these leaders, especially with some of the more desperate ones, and Abimelech, and we understand that there is no leader on earth that can replace God, and everyone should have been looking to God. And those are the goals Daniel has laid out, I think, that are well-fitting for our time spent tonight. We're going to try to list all 12 judges, and I have a full list tonight that we can work through, and as well as some of the enemies and unique facts about them. We'll talk about the four-part cycle of sin cycle and understand how this fits in. We're kind of to the end of this downward spiral, and we'll talk about that for a few minutes tonight. So, who was the first judge we discussed? Othniel. And the enemy? Mesopotamia. And something unique about Othniel, I didn't give you anything new from Sunday. So if you remember. Yeah, nephew, knight in shining armor. Ooh, that blue is bright. Who came after Othniel? Ehud. He fought against particularly King Eglon, right? And we remember the sword being swallowed up. Man, that is an interesting story. After Ehud, Shamgar. And what's interesting, one of the interesting things about Shamgar that we learn is that it actually gives us a lot of color for the story that we were talking about on Sunday and leading into tonight. So maybe we'll recap some of those things. After Shamgar was Deborah, and Barak, and the chariots, and the victory went to the praise of a woman. And then I'm rushing ahead. Gideon, and I wrote needed proof. What other unique aspects of Gideon did you recognize or remember? 300 men. He did great things with 300 men. And after Gideon, his son came along, Abimelech. And I didn't actually put an enemy in here. We could talk about that. But my unique fact was something from Daniel Broadwell's father. But do y'all have a unique fact about Abimelech? A unique fact about Abimelech? Yeah. Another gender story. Anything else? Yeah, he killed his brothers, and as Daniel's father said, we whisper Abimelech in the list of judges. After that, you see two minor judges, if you will, Tola and Jair, and I think you'll see this with several of these minor judges. We see the 30 sons, donkeys, towns, etc. After that is Jephthah, and he made the great promise, the vow to God. And who came out? Daughter. And right before we read about Samson. We read about 3 more in consecutive order. And I probably would not get this right if I was sitting out there right now, but that's right. That's chapter 10 there, right? End of chapter 10, beginning. Anyway, quick hits. We learn about them really quickly. We learn about some things very similar to Tola and Jer, right? That there was 30 sons and things of that nature. Really, the image is they've kind of made themselves. There's aspects of how they've created a position for themselves within the nation, right? And I think if you look at this, this is not necessarily a chronological list. There's a lot of overlap that we find in this list. Maybe territorial in nature. Some of the people even might have existed at the same time and didn't know each other because of the distances between them and the tribes. All right, so there's the judges. It's a great effort to try and memorize these. This is why I'm trying to build on Daniel's work there. Here's the cycle of sin. I was going to throw this at you Sunday, and I don't know. I was duplicating slides and all back and forth. I don't know what happened to my deck on Sunday, but I learned a different device to remember these, and that was a rebellion, retribution, repentance, and restitution. So Daniel didn't like the S one. I'm giving you a second level there, so to speak, a nod at my childhood Bible classes, but there's one with R's if you are against the S's. And really, I think what's interesting about this is it's so easy to see this in our own life. It's easy to see this in the lives of others, especially when we come up or remember a pain point in our life or where we really know we need God's help out of desperation. But hopefully these stories help us to focus on them before the sin happens, before the rebellion kicks in. And what was the rebellion most of the time? What do we read about? And in fact, sometimes there's a lot of rebellion, and it led up to this activity, and it wasn't until then that God came in with the hammer, so to speak. What is that rebellious act that really set him off? Idolatry, praising other gods. And I think it's really easy to dismiss that in our lives. It just looks much different today, but it probably has the same name. So with that, here's this downward spiral. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Daniel has hit on it. He'll hit on it again. This really kind of rang home with me when I took in his concept that the writer had a very particular purpose, and that was to tell us of the depravity that was going on at the time, and really how it kind of spun out of control. God tried, and ultimately we ended up in this place where everyone was doing right in their own eyes. So quick Samson review. And we covered a lot of material. We even rushed through some at the end. But y'all tell me, what was special about Samson's birth? Could be a lot of answers to this one. The Nazirite vow. His whole life was supposed to be, and that was particularly unique. His whole life was supposed to be under the Nazirite vow. And what did that entail? We didn't really spend a lot of time on that, but not cutting the hair, which Samson focused on. No strong drink. That was right. The unclean food, and nothing from the vine. Yeah, if you go back to Numbers 6, you learn they couldn't even eat the skins of the grapes or drink any vinegar or anything associated with that. So. That's an interesting thing to discuss because Samson's going to make a bold claim in this chapter that I think we'll want to talk about, but we'll get to that. Yeah, Albert.
You're going to have a son. Sorry, you're going to have a son. So God came to them and told his birth was spoken or spoken to be, to where we don't have that, there was a child in a field and they found him and he became a great and mighty warrior or anything, but this was initiated, his coming to the earth was initiated by God.
Sure.
Is a point that I'm thinking.
No, that's an excellent point. I think there's a lot of really interesting things around that, that the barren nature and the parallels we discussed there, but great point. How did God use Samson in his marriage to the Philistines at the top of chapter 14? How did he use that event to God's purposes, his own purposes? Yeah. Rick and I exchanged some emails this week on this, and I think clearly we have to say God did not want Samson marrying this woman as a Israelite, maybe even as a Nazirite. That's not explicit, but I think it's probably embedded. He did not want, but we learned that God was using this act to his own intention. And what was that? Really, it was the next two chapters, right? We see this happens and Samson responds, and then this escalates and he responds, and they escalate and go get him, and then he responds, and so this back and forth. And really, there's probably 3 episodes here, right? There's the birth story. There's chapters 14 and 15 where all the killing happens, and it's this back and forth event. And then there's the last episode that we'll talk about tonight with Delilah. But really, this one marriage perpetrated at least 1,100 deaths and the destruction of Philistine crops and all kinds of things. And it made the Philistines on their heels. It put them to where they were scared of the people of Israel again. And that was significant for the whole time that Samson was to be judge over Israel. And does anybody remember how long that was? We hit on it very quickly. Last verse of 15. 20 years. If you look at the judges, that's actually not that short of a time period, right? Many kings, many judges served less time than that. And so we don't think a lot of Samson, but he was given a lot of time to redeem the people of Israel. And what's so interesting about that is it's remarkably silent at the beginning of the story that any of the people cry out, that any of the people ask for repentance. We see that in all the other stories, but not in this one. And yet God sends Samson, who looks nothing like a warrior that we think of in terms of what God would want to defend his nation. I don't know if you can put those together to amount to anything, but it says something to me about how God works in and around us, and maybe more particularly in the Old Testament. So that marriage was used as a catalyst for probably the rest of the story. Any other thoughts about that marriage? Try to spend a few more minutes here on review, and then we'll get into the text in 16. I mentioned the 1,100 people that were killed. What are some of the other pains that Samson inflicted on these Philistines? He ruined their harvest. I probably just shouldn't have said the 1,100 yet, because there's 3 stories, right? The 30 he had to kill, the destruction at the 1,000 after the men of Judah came for him, and the foxes are the main stories that we read about. And we read about the lion, and I gave you some graphic detail that if you tie the language in Judges to Deuteronomy, he probably ripped the lion from the hind legs. And then we learn about this very graphic way of he tore them hip and thigh, talking about the Philistine soldiers. And if you put those 2 ideas together, it's very, very ugly. Of course, there's also the jawbone of the donkey. We've talked a lot about these things. He piled up these dead bodies. He is not adhering to the Nazirite vow on many occasions. And it never mentions the wine, but it's hard to imagine him in these Philistine cities at these weddings and things of this nature and not partaking, although maybe that's not the case. And this may be a peculiar question to you, but do you think that Samson had a clear conscience in all of these events? Is there anything in the text that talks about how he felt about these atrocities he brought on to the Philistines?
Okay with what's going on.
Yeah, yeah. So he gets the dirty garments, but then when they burn his wife, I don't know, and he tears them hip and thigh, right? He says, this time it won't be my fault. And I don't know what that says about the previous event that happened where he went to Ashkelon and killed the 30 people to get their garments. But clearly he's thinking about that throughout this story. And it's just so telling, right? What is revealed about the men of Judah? How many come to get him? 3,000. Were they scared of him? Were the Philistines scared? I think everybody was scared of this guy. It must not have been a subtle thing. He must have carried a presence about him that was, everyone knew who and what he was capable of. But not only that, they wouldn't stand up. They had this great warrior with them, and they wouldn't stand up to the Philistines even with him. They came and cowered and, please let us give you over so they don't destroy us. We have no problem with them, which probably means they were paying them tithes. They weren't going to war with the Philistines. I would point to a lot of cowardly traits that this story reveals about them. So where do we leave Samson at the end of this story? A very unique little brief story that happens where he kills these 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey, and he cries out to God, and he's like, what? I'm thirsty. You're going to let me, I do all this, and now you're going to let me die of thirst? And it's so funny when these stories come up, Jacob and Esau. And again, it's easy to look at these 4,000 years later and be somewhat judgmental, but how does your faith wane after you just slaughtered 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey? I don't know. But God has graciousness, generosity in his heart, and provides this water and this rock for Samson, which is, I'll let you infer what you want to with that, because I don't know how to see through that all of these things that he's done against his vow, and yet God is still supporting him. But maybe that is the point. And so we're going to get into chapter 16 here. I know you can't read this, but I do like this map. We talked about the green line here, and you can see he was a Danite, and the Philistines had taken over most of Dan, and you'll read in chapter 2, back with Shamgar, that they pushed them up. We always think north. I did the first time I read chapter 2, but really it means up into the hill country. And you can see here that they're living in the hills. And again, Zorah was originally given to the tribe of Judah, and the remnant with Ezra, we see Zorah going back to the tribe of Judah, not Dan. So this was probably some temporary areas that Judah was allowing the tribes of Dan to live in because they had been fully run out of their territory. And we talked about the story of the marriage, and this happened here in this valley of Sorek. And that's where tonight's episode, the second part of the episode is going to happen again here, right close to his home. He comes all the way down 23 miles to kill those people for the 30 garments, and comes back and delivers them to Timnah. And that's kind of where we'll pick up tonight. But we are going to start our story down here in Gaza, which is at least 40 miles from Zorah, and again 40 miles from Hebron. So as you think about this story, it's going to be interesting. And it's not 100% clear exactly how far he carried these gates that we're about to read about. I'm really doing good here. That we're about to read about. Sorry, guys. But anyway, we're going to read about him tearing off these gates, and then we'll read about the story of Samson and Delilah, and we'll come back and talk about it all together. So chapter 16 and verse 1. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there, and he went into her. When the Gazites were told, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet, saying, in the morning, when it's daylight, we will kill him. And Samson lay low until midnight, and then he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings, and as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, look, you have mocked me and told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, if they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Therefore Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And the men were lying in wait, staying in the room. But he broke them off his arms like a thread. Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of a loom. So she wove it tightly, the batten of the loom, and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. Then she said to him, how can you say, I love you, when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and have not told me where your great strength lies. And it came to pass, when she pestered him daily with her words, and she pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all his heart, and said to her, no razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak, and be like any other man. When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up once more, for he has told me all that is in his heart. So the lord of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. Then she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he awoke from his sleep, and he said, I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. However, the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy. When the people saw him, they praised their God, and they said, our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our land, and the one who multiplied our dead. So it happened, when their hearts were merry, that they said, call for Samson, that he may perform for us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them, and they stationed him between the pillars. Then Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, let me fill the pillars which support the temple, so that I can lean on them. Now the temple was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and about 3,000 men and women on the roof, watching while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. Then Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords, and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. And his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him, and brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in a tomb of his father Manoah. And he had judged Israel 20 years. So we start off with this story where he's in Gaza. What business would an Israelite have in Gaza in this day? Not a whole lot, right? So you can see the Philistine territory. It is deep within the Philistine territory. What's south of here? Desert. This is a major route between Egypt and the Asian trade routes, right? So this is actually one of the 5 Philistine cities. It probably was the capital at the time, you can infer because of its importance, would have been so great to the region. And so he's down there, way away from home. We learned a little bit about his secrecy from his parents with the lion. I'm speculating, I suppose, but why do we think he was down there? The men around his area probably didn't like him too much. And the people of Israel probably were not active in the activities that he was about to partake in, right? He wanted to go and have this whore, and so he went far away from the area that he usually operates in. And the story goes, what happens? Yeah, they're coming to kill him. This is a great city, right? So let's talk about what kind of gate they probably have. A little wooden one with a broken thing? No. This is going to be a big gate, and they probably close the doors at night. And so that's why they said in the morning, they say they wait all night, but they say in the morning we'll get him, because they think he can't get out of the city until they open these gates, right? So he gets up at midnight, and he's like, hoist them on, and it depends on the way you read this text. It could be that the hill is just facing Hebron, but a lot of the interpretations actually say it was a hill near or towards Hebron, which is 40 miles away, all the way over here. And even if it is, do you see any hills in this topographical map right here? This is a great plain. So even if it wasn't all the way to Hebron, he made it really far before placing this gate. And that's a big symbol, right? He's actually going up there on the hill and putting this thing up there as a message to the entire region. But really interesting. It's an interesting story in its own right, but when you kind of unpack some of that, the distance and things, it's quite impressive what he does. We'll look at this picture one more time. I don't know how proportionate that is. Another thing I read is these gates were never just wooden because they would just burn. There's usually some kind of nails or iron completely surrounding it. A superhuman feat, nonetheless. Which brings us to the main event, what everyone thinks of usually with Samson, and that was his affair with Delilah, right? And one of the things that I keep coming back to is how smart was this guy? Clearly he was driven by passion. We see that for the 3rd time now, that his eyes were guiding him. We learned in the first marriage, right? And I don't think the poetry is lost on us in the story that ends up costing him his eyes, so to speak. So let's talk about a few questions here. Daniel gets better with the animations here, but we'll work with what we got. I already kind of asked the first question. I'm sorry, guys. Was Samson a smart man? The point I was just getting at. You read this story, and do you see someone who's smart? We'll talk about Solomon, and he had many. In fact, you could probably see some parallels, right, between Solomon and Samson, except Solomon had the wisdom. I wonder, was Samson robbed of his smarts? But do you think he was smart in this episode with Delilah or the episode with the other woman? I mean, what's clearly going to happen? Yeah.
What I was saying is that Delilah lied to him 3 times, all 3 times seeking to find a way to rob him of the strength, knowing that she was going to betray him to the Philistines.
That's right.
And yet, ultimately, he still did, and I can't figure that out. I mean, you don't have to be smart to figure this one out.
No. And we got another comment over here.
I mean, he obviously was very weak. He gave in to temptation easily. I mean, I go think back to the story of a lion carcass. I don't know what shape the lion carcass was in, but any carcass, I don't care if it's a delicious, French dessert inside the lion carcass, it's gross. I mean, eating honey out of a lion carcass. But he was so tempted by the honey, even though it wasn't something so vile. And that's kind of like what we see with these women that he involves in his life. It's like, I guess he just had that weakness.
Yeah, that's a great point. He didn't have much willpower, did he? Or he didn't care if he did. Yes, Mona.
I think he thought he was smarter than everybody. So he would tell her a story, and the next day he will get out of trouble each time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like he thinks he's the smartest one in the room.
Smartest and maybe the strongest. I think that definitely applies. Yeah. If he didn't think that he could put himself in any peril, maybe that's what he was thinking when this happened. And in fact, we kind of see he wakes up and he's surprised that he doesn't have any power. It seems like, and that probably played a direct role, which would have been the ultimate root cause of his trouble then, if that's the case. He didn't believe, or he believed too much that the power was coming from where? Himself. He had forgotten all these escapades had made him think he was the source of his strength. In fact, there's a lot of secular scholars who say, oh, this is just a Hebrew version of the Hercules story or something of that nature. And in fact, when we look at those other stories, oftentimes they have this egotistical, I can't be defeated power, and that becomes their weakness. I don't think that those two really have any similarities, other than this kind of power often maybe corrupts a man. But was he smart? I mean, she was the one who bound him up every time. It wasn't like she's supposedly his lover, right? Like, it's not like she let someone else do the dirty work. Now, granted, this was probably a lot of riches, but I think it's probably a good guess that these were different instances. He would come and tell her, and the next time he was there, they would come and be in the room and things of this nature. But I don't know. It seems quite baffling. Other than just he knew he had this strength, and no matter what happened, he would be okay. Who cut Samson's hair? That's what I thought. Actually, she calls one of the guards, maybe a barber, to come in and do it. She does not actually do the cutting, and I can believe that for the life of me. I read it like 3 times. I was like, no, Delilah cut Samson's hair. But just a little trivia side note there. And so what happens next? Yeah, she's so confident. She calls these Philistine lords back, and there's probably a representation of 5 different Philistine lords here. And what does that tell you, first of all? They're sick of this guy. I mean, this is a national menace. This isn't some regional pestilence that the sheriff's dealing with, right? It's a national menace. And to your point, she tells him, I know what's in his heart. He's really told me. They come and pay her before it's even done. That's how confident that she is, and she sells them on that confidence. It looks like they might have given up on her because she has to call them in this time, right? Like, no, really, I've got it. And she gets them to come in, and the job is quite easy, right? And what's one of the first things they do to him? Or I guess let's just talk about the different punishments they gouge his eyes out, which is, again, poetic, going back to one of the first things we read about him in chapter 14. I have seen a woman, and then at the 14:2 and 14:3, get her for me, for she pleases me. And in another version, I have the ESV here, but in the King James, it makes direct reference to it pleases his eyes, right? And so this is kind of the bookends of the story, that these eyes get gouged out. What other punishments does he receive? Yeah, probably a fetter would imply wrist and ankles. So he's well bound. And there's one other thing that comes to mind for me, the grinding, and don't mishear my gender bias in this, but at the time that was probably a gender role, and so it was meant to be ultimately demeaning as woman's work, as an insult to him. So here you have the strongest man to ever attack the Philistines, and he's reduced down to this woman's work, and he is really put to shame in his day and age there. And some time passes, right? It's interesting to me that they're having this celebration, but why do we know some time passes after these punishments are inflicted? Because his hair grows back. I guess there could be some acceleration there, but at least the way the text reads to me, we see his hair grows back, and they have this celebration. The god Dagon is probably the god of wheat, the god of maybe vegetables. Maybe it was just a harvest god that they were praising. And he was the demon of their harvest. And so there's some wordplay going on here that does not translate over to the English at all. But so they're having this celebration, and it was fitting for them in this celebration to bring him in and mock him, because their God has now won over this superhuman, right? And so he comes in to perform, and I think you really could spend some time speculating on the structure and how it would be that there would be a structure strong enough for 3,000 people. Yes, A, he's going to be superhuman to take that down, but B, how does 1 or 2 pillars cripple this whole thing where he kills upwards of 3,000 people? And if you feel like being entertained, you can think about that as you're commuting sometime, maybe in the car, because it's quite. I read I guess it was a commentary, and they had gone to the trouble to talk about the force and the type of pillars, and okay, maybe that's too far, but it was really interesting just to actually try to visualize it and see how the structure would collapse in on itself. Maybe the people were all trying to get a look at him. They were up on the balcony, and he was down there by the pillars. Maybe they were too crowded in one area or something like that. But a very interesting way for him to go. And really, whether this is a case of repentance or he just wants his final say and he's bargaining with God, I tried to research enough to give you some color there. I don't know. It would seem that with the return of God's spirit to him that Samson's heart was somewhat remorseful for his actions. But ultimately, God's strength was with him even when he wasn't doing what God asked him to do. So I don't know if there's anything there or not. Nonetheless, God fulfills the prophecy that was made to Manoah's wife, and that very specifically, Samson would begin to deal with the Philistines. And that's what he's done here. I mean, 3,000 people plus 1,100 to 1,500 maybe. I mean, that's at least 4,000, 4,100 bare minimum, maybe upwards of 4,500 by one man. That was quite a blow over 20 years, right? And that's just what's written about. So God executed his will through this man that did not return God's favor. What patterns or parallels do you see in this episode in chapter 16? And it's kind of a trick question, Brian.
Same pattern that I see in the judges and of mankind for that matter, but sin or rebellion, and then they are repressed or oppressed, and calls out to God, and God gives him his strength back.
Yeah, that was my answer. I think, and we are ending the rest of the book of Judges is an epilogue, so to speak. We are ending the story of the judges themselves here with these verses, and I think it is a encapsulation of the entire story we've read, and Brian's spot on there. And in some ways, we have to understand the women in the story then as the idols that the nation sought after, right? And I guess that kind of brings me to the ultimate question then. So here we are at the end of the list of judges. And what is a judge then? I think I was surprised by my answer at this point. A ruler but not king, even though Abimelech was the son of a king. Yeah. Any other ideas? Yeah, Daniel.
Someone that in some way or another, whether for the positive or for the negative, turned God's people back towards him.
Yeah. I think that did happen for sure. I think if that didn't happen also in some of these stories, I don't know that we don't even talk about the people of Judah that came up against him in this episode, right? I mean, did the people cry out? No. All we know about Samson is he beat up the people's enemies, right? And maybe that's what we're reduced to in understanding exactly what a judge is someone that God used to take care of his people. Yeah, Albert. He's jogging.
I see in Samson, though, he's in communication with God. And so, like, when he thirsts, he called to God directly. And so I don't know of any missing scrolls. I don't know of any conspiracy, but there appears to be some communication between God and Samson and carrying out of or turning his ways into fulfillment of showing who is God and Creator. So it's, in the end, just like we hope anybody who lives a life of folly finally gets it and decides to follow God or to call upon God. That's what we would hope, or that's what was hoped of me when I became a Christian, that people were hoping that I would get it and then put on the name of Christ.
Yeah. Good point. I think if we look at the story of Manoah's wife being barren, this was a Savior that should not have existed, albeit God stepped in, right? If God had not stepped in, the Savior would never have had the strength, would never have even been born. And I think that is the point of these judges is they were God's deliverers, and we see that in chapter 2 and verse 16. And I think this is the definition of a judge. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. And maybe that's all we're supposed to understand about what a judge is. But certainly God's grace came through, even in very bad situations. Well, that's my material, and that's the bell. So thank you so much for your time tonight. We'll all look forward to Daniel being back on Sunday with Judges 17 here.